All right, everybody, Adam back with another episode of the Bowhunter Chronicles podcast. And today, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll notice I don't have my Lucky Buck Perfect Perennial back here behind me because I've sent that up to the UP with my dad. He's up there doing some what we would call our food plot work, but we're just getting into it. But we're talking with Lucky Buck's own Dave Wheeler tonight. So how are you doing today, Dave?
Very good. Thank you. Really excited to be on your show here.
Well, we've been doing this for quite some time, and we've been hunting, forever, but we have not been, I guess, using the mineral. We're not doing it everything like the big guys do. We were public land guys, and I've got a piece of property, like I had mentioned, my dad is up in the UP now. And we talked to some guys last year, one guy in particular up in the UP, we're in Michigan, where they can still use mineral. And the way that he's using it for inventory. He's using it to kind of track deer activities, all that. And that was, somewhat intriguing to us. And then, getting to work with you guys this year, that's really, we've really been able to implement that, within the restraints of what Michigan allows us to do. So, during the winter months, which may or may not be the most beneficial for the deer herd, but I'm sure we'll get into that. So let's take a little bit of a introduction to yourself. Like your hunting history, your background, with hunting, because that the mainstay of our show is about the hunter. And sometimes we see products as gimmicks or things. Everybody's just trying to tell you what you got to do to make it easier, right? So what's your history with hunting in general?
So I grew up on a dairy farm. My brother and I actually started it in Western Michigan in Hart when I was a freshman in high school. Went to Michigan State for 4 years for dairy science, learned some about nutrition, and ended up getting out of the dairy business. But in the meantime, we led a really busy life on the farm, and my parents never hunted, so I never hunted. I came down to Hillsdale about 35 years ago and worked for a couple of different feed companies in dairy nutrition. Learned a lot about nutrition, and had an opportunity to buy a mineral company that has been around since 1918. I'm the third owner. I bought it in 96 and started mixing and selling custom minerals to dairy farmers with my own business. Before that, I had worked for two other feed companies for 8 years and learned a lot about balancing rations and diets and stuff. But this company catered mostly to small family dairy farms, which were going out of business at a fairly rapid rate even back then, and it's accelerated even more now. And I knew I would have to diversify at some point to either that, or I'd have to cover a lot more territory, which I didn't want to do. And at the time in the mid 90s in Michigan, deer cocaine was really popular. And I thought I can do better than that. And that was when I started working on a formula that would be healthy for the deer, as well as an attractant. And I did not really connect all the dots at that point, that a healthier deer has a bigger antler. And so I actually took it up north, and one of my first customers was Jay's Sporting Goods, and I sold to a bunch of other mom and pop grocery store or gas stations. And in the fall of 97 and 98, and one of my dairy farm customers down here in Addison actually had the foresight to put it out in the spring when they really need it. And in the fall of 98, he shot the two biggest bucks he'd ever harvested in 45 years of hunting his little dairy farm in Addison. And I actually quit making Lucky Buck in 99 because of TB in northern Michigan. TB was affecting my dairy customers. They had to quarantine their herds and had difficulty, testing. And so I just decided to quit making it. But when this guy, Delmer Kyle, shot these 2 big bucks, my neighbor saw them and came and said he had to have some. And so another neighbor came and said he had to have some, and the local feed company said that he had some guys that really liked it. So I made a 500-pound batch just for my 2 neighbors and the local feed mill. Well, the one guy that was one of the guys that I was selling it to found the sheds on what ended up being the world's biggest 8-point, and right where he was feeding the mineral. And then he found one set in 99 and 2 sets of his 2000 sheds. And then he was killed on my farm in 2001. And that's what got the marketing going for Lucky Buck. I freely tell people, if it weren't for that buck, I wouldn't be in the business today. That's what got people's attention. And he's just an incredible deer. Longest beams in the book when he was killed. He's still second for any whitetail for beam length, and the biggest 8-point ever, and perfectly clean, 185 inches. And he'd been on it for 3 years. We know how old he was. We'd sent the teeth in. It was just a phenomenal story. And that's what got the entire ball rolling. Then I went back into production and started marketing, and it's just been a real blessing ever since. It's just taken off, and it's a real simple concept, but it's very distinctive from what other companies had been doing as far as its formulation and stuff, because I didn't grow up as a hunter. So I didn't read up on Dr. Kroll and Dr. Woods and all the leading deer biologists, what they say. I didn't know any better. I just did it the way I knew I had to do it to control intake and to make a deer healthier. I didn't, like I said, put all the dots together and realize what it would do to antlers at the same time. I was just wanting them to be healthier than they would be on, at that time, the deer cocaine product.
So let's step back just a little bit to when you decided that you could do a better job than the deer cocaine product. And I remember that. I mean, I had some of that, and it was just one of those things. You got the marketing behind it, the way that it was packaged. It was kind of neat, and you just threw it out there. But as you formulated this, before you bring something up to Jay Sporting Goods, right, you had to have some sort of data or something to show for it. And from being being like a non-hunter standpoint, like how do you just make it and then you just say, yep, mine's better? Like what was that process like?
I did not say mine was better. That's the first distinction. And it's really my background in the nutrition side of it. It revolves. The one thing that I freely tell everybody is selenium is a wonderful, highly underutilized, highly underemphasized product that I put a lot of faith in. The problem is it's toxic if they get too much of it. So you got to be really conservative, or you got to control their intake. And so I've saw the results in all the years of my dairy nutrition. I saw the results of a selenium deficiency and of adequate selenium, and it is a huge difference. And I knew that if I could get an aggressive level of selenium into those deer, that they would be healthier. So I utilized salt as a control mechanism where nobody else did. And like I said, if I would have read Dr. Kroll or Dr. Woods or any of the leading deer biologists, it would have been marketing suicide to make a mix that was 2/3 salt. But there's no other way to control the intake on a wild whitetail deer or range cattle or pasture cattle, where my experience was. Whenever I made a mix of mineral for cattle on pasture, where I couldn't force it into their regular diet when they were just grazing, similar to what deer do. I used salt to determine how much they were going to eat. If they were not eating enough, I would lower the salt level. And if they were eating too much, I would increase the salt level. And I could regulate exactly what I wanted them to eat. And I used that same thought process on the selenium level controlled by salt for the deer. And so I was pretty confident that these deer were going to be healthy, because Michigan, along with 90% of the US, is deficient, if not devoid, in natural selenium. There's a few counties in Kansas, Texas, and the Dakotas have some selenium in naturally, but the rest of the country does not. So I knew that it would satisfy that need. Now, and I knew that deer would be healthier. Now, I put a lot of this together since then as to how important and how it's affecting it, specifically on antler growth. But at that time, I just knew it would be better than that other product that was on the market.
Right. But I mean, so if I was a Jay Sporting Goods and you've got people trying to pitch your products all the time to sell in the store and everything, you got a guy that doesn't hunt, that, you know, has a deer mineral that says it's going to make the deer healthier. Like, what was the testing up until that point?
Zero. When I walked into Jay's and sold them, I had an apple flavored salt based mineral, locally made or made in Michigan. And some people say I'm a fairly good salesman, fairly persuasive. And I talked them into giving it a try. And that was end of story. There's a little more to the story as far as the naming of the product that makes for a really interesting. I actually called it something else before I named it Lucky Buck. And I could have got myself into some serious trouble if I would have continued that and hadn't caught the problem. And my wife takes credit and deserves credit for coming up with the brand Lucky Buck. And we did a search, but that's a whole nother story. But it really, at that point there was no testing. I knew that they would eat it, and I knew that they would be healthier based on my nutritional background. But other than that, it was nothing else at that point. And I didn't claim anything else at that point until I figured out why it was doing what it was doing to the antlers. I didn't put any guarantees on it. It was, like I said, an apple flavored salt. And most hunters, when they see the word apple and they see the word salt, they know that the deer are going to go for it. Now, everything else has developed since then, and it's gotten a lot more complex as far as why it's working and how it's working. But at that point, that was it.
So has the formulation changed, or I guess how much has the formulation changed from that first walking through the door into Jay's and to what's on the shelves now?
Absolutely exactly the same. I have wanted to make some slight improvements and changes, but I want to be able to truthfully say that that's exactly what this world record 8.8 when he grew that antler. And since then, 2 years later, the state record for archery was taken in Hillsdale County, and he was on it for 2 years. And the next year, the youth state record was taken over by Marshall, and he was on it for 2 years. And the next year, the biggest one ever killed in Ohio, 305 inches, was on it for 1 year. And so all of these just came so quickly and so with such obvious connections that I really didn't dare change anything, because I didn't know exactly. I mean, this was working, and we haven't slowed down since. I mean, we just produced the buck that beat the Jordan buck, the biggest typical, and I'm going tomorrow to see one that I met a guy at the Louisville Farm Machinery Show where we had a booth set up that killed another 230 some incher out of southern Indiana last year, and it just goes on and on. And the photos were trail cameras are proving, not proving amount of consumption, but proving a lot about the patterns and how much these deer are eating. The trail cameras we have on that Huff buck are just amazing. Over a 3-year period, over 8 miles, and with his nose just chowing down on it. So I haven't dared change the formula at all at this point, even though there are some things that I think maybe could improve it. And there are some areas of the country that this isn't by itself the total package of what you might need in non-agriculture areas, in big woods where there's no cropland. Phosphorus may become a limiting factor. I'm confident that this will still make a difference, but there may be another step in addition. So I've considered a formula for the deep woods or for the West. Texas has different needs than we do because they have some natural occurring selenium. And so, but I have had such good results in Kansas. Just a couple of years ago, we had the state record for Kansas, had trail camera pictures. He'd had it for 3 years, and it's just, it's universally working wherever anybody is using it. So this is exactly the same formula we began with.
So I guess from like a devil's advocate standpoint, right? Your product, the Lucky Buck, with your formulation, and you've got all of this data. Do you have any studies or anything that show it versus any other mineral or other formulations? I guess just not from like a claim standpoint, but just anecdotally, seeing this one, because you've got guarantees on there. And one of the things that I thought was like super cool is, right on the packaging, it says, if you use this for 2 years and you don't see a difference in the deer, we'll give you your money back. And, and it says, I don't know, you feed it as it's directed, basically you'll refund the money, which I think is a very, I don't want to say bold statement. It's very confident. You're saying, look, this is what's going to happen. But in these other areas, right, where other people are using minerals, and there were minerals before Lucky Buck, and there's plenty that have come after. Have you done any comparisons, or it doesn't really matter to you?
So my best proof, I think, is the reaction I get when I do shows. And at one point we were doing almost 20 shows a year, commercial consumer shows. And now we don't need to, and it's a lot of travel and expense, and we're doing 4 or 5 a year now. But I've done some of them for 18 years. I did some of them that I'm not doing now for as many as 13 years straight. And I try and have the same spot in the show. So when people come back, they know where to find me, and if they have any issues. But that to me is my best proof. It's real life situations. It's unsolicited. It's unbiased. It's just what people are saying, and it is so consistent. That to me, if I could package that in a bottle for marketing, for advertising, if I could get somebody to just stand next to my booth. I mean, wherever I go, usually the booth across from me and the booths next to me, by the time the end of the show, they want to take everything I've got left. And because they have heard the people come, and now they just bring their cell phone out and start showing me pictures. And the consistency is so phenomenal that convinces me better than anything else. Now, the only trial that I would really have a lot of faith in would be, like in a pen situation, is if you had split buck fawns, and put one on a control, and you did this over multiple years, be tremendously difficult and expensive. And it still does not give you the confidence. The number one thing is getting them to eat it at the right time of the year in the wild, getting them to eat it at the right time and in the right amount. And that, I think, is where our real advantage is. It's not so much that any of my competitors have necessarily poor formulation. They have some really good formulation in a lot of these competing products. They just can't get them to eat it, and they can't get it to eat it when they need it, and they can't get people to remember to put it out when they need to. And I think that's why we've had more success, is because people are putting it out early in the spring. I have a memory association trick, which I have a lot of people using now. It's just, we get a good increase in intake because of our formulation with the high salt. We get a large increase in intake right at green up in the spring when those antlers really need it. And nobody else is really emphasizing that you have to have it out then, and that you need to remember when you're busy in the spring. I mean, most people think about it, when they're tuning their bow up in June and July, and it's a little late. You need to have it before you mow your lawn in the spring, when that grass is just lush and full of water. That's when you need to have it out. That's where you start really seeing the benefit of it.
And so into that timing piece, like from a nutrition standpoint, like throughout the year, what are why is it necessary? Why is it more necessary for the health of the deer? And let's remove the antler growth portion of it, right? And let's go into that, where you started with this whole thing, which was with the healthier deer herd, and kind of like what it's doing for your herd at the different times throughout the year.
So this is the part that I put together afterwards. This is not how I originally made the formula or what I had in mind. But what I have learned is that first of all, they eat a very consistent amount of salt. But it's different amounts at different times of the year. And what happens is their diet in late winter and early spring is dead grass and dry browse. And when the new grass starts growing, that's all they're eating is that new growth grass. And it's almost 90% water. So their entire diet is almost 90% water. It flushes the electrolytes right out of their system. So they crave sodium. That's why you see them along the roadsides, desperately looking for road salt along the roads. That's why we get about a 6-fold increase in intake right at green up. From 2 weeks prior to green up till 2 weeks after green up, you can see a 6-fold increase in the consumption of Lucky Buck. That's so critical, because right then is when that antler's growing, when the does are birthing and having fawns. And going back to my selenium example, selenium is relatively poorly stored in the body. So they can't just mobilize it out of their store that they've built up in their body like they can, like calcium. They can mobilize some out of the bones for milk production and for antler growth, but they can't really do that with selenium. By getting that boost into them right when they really need it is just absolutely critical, and that's makes a lot of difference.
And so then from that aspect of it, why, if I was a consumer, why would it not be just a gimmick to say, well, now you got to give it all year round?
So I want to maintain the site. I want to keep the deer coming into it. I want them to form a habit. I want to get the residual benefit of getting the trail camera pictures. And there's nothing better than Lucky Buck to put in front of your trail camera as far as a cost effectiveness. You can put corn, and sometimes of the year you're gonna get more pictures, but for the cost, it's gonna last you a lot longer and be a lot more practical in front of the camera. Then as you get into hunting season, you want to keep them coming in. And I tell people, I hear all the time when I'm at a show, we don't have enough acreage to hold deer. All we have is 10 acres. All we have is 20 acres. And my spin on that is the smaller your acreage, the more important it is to give him another reason to be there. And this is one more reason to be there. He's going to be looking for a sodium source of some kind. And if you give him one, that's one more piece of the puzzle that keeps him on your property. And when you have the smaller properties, you may not be able to keep him on there all the time, but you got to give him a reason to be coming back there. And so I want to maintain that all year long, and it doesn't cost you much to maintain it. So for 25 deer, to quantify it a little bit, for 25 deer hitting a particular lucky buck site, it's going to take you a total of 5 buckets for the entire year, giving it all year long. You're going to use about a bucket a month from green up until about the end of July, about a bucket a month, and then maybe a third of a bucket every other month just to maintain the site. And that's all it takes. So you get the benefit of keeping them coming in. You get the benefit of them not getting deficient throughout the rest of the year. But if you're really tight on money, if you really want to just focus on antlers, then from green up till the middle of July, and then put a trophy rock or put a salt block out and, get a similar type of a benefit the rest of the year. But it at a third of a bucket every other month, it really doesn't cost you much just to maintain that site for the rest of the year, and then you keep them coming in that way. So.
And from that small acreage thought process or whatever, is there a best place for setting up a mineral site? A lot of times we'll see, I guess, and again, in my inexperience, I would always see guys putting them on stumps or putting them, here. And then, my buddy that I said has been using it forever is taking, 3 of the buckets down to Missouri. And he's like, there's these must be an old mineral site because it's just dug up and tore up. Like, is there a better place for it, near bedding, near water,
If you've got water source, then fairly near water is definitely good, but it's not an absolute requirement. I do like, you mentioned stumps. I do like putting it up on a stump or a log, especially in marshy, mucky areas or like sandy areas where it could percolate down in with some rainfall. I personally have a stump. It's a cut off piece of firewood that's about 18 inches across. I took a chainsaw and dished it out, and I've used that for 15 years, and they've chewed it up. It's got a crack in it so the water gets away from it. They eat around it when it spills, or I've had people that take a chainsaw and cut a V down a downed log and make a natural trough. I don't like using plywood or anything, that's not really natural, because I'm afraid my more elusive bucks could shy away from it. So a stump or a log that's already there, a rotten log, you just kick the top in and just pour it in that or something like that. But placement wise, pinch points, funnels, if you don't have it in a pinch point or funnel, it may take you more sites to get the coverage done. But I actually like to put some in my sanctuary area early when I'm out shed hunting or something, and then just leave that, and then later on use my sites that are outside of that sanctuary area where I have my cameras and stuff, and keep a better handle on it. But put a little bit into that sanctuary area, and then just leave it and leave it alone, and then your bucks that may not come out as much still have access to it that way.
And so, right there, you're using very much deer hunter words, right? And you said you didn't start out as a deer hunter. You started this process.
I've been doing this for 25 years, and I do hunt, not very successfully, but I do hunt mostly to relate to my customers. And I've talked to so many of my customers and I've had some biologists help me on my own property. That 8-point was killed there, and we've seen some really good bucks, actually better than him since then. But they're way smarter than I am. But I would at some point my goal was to kill one with a recurve, and I did buy a really good crossbow last year, and that's probably going to be the way that I kill that real monster, because the recurve's pretty limited on range. But so I do get out and I do enjoy it, but I just am not good at it. I don't have the patience and the time to devote to it. That I know my limitations. So.
Sure. So how did that start, the deer hunting? So you got into it so we're very open and honest, like with all of our misfortunes in the woods and, our limitations as well. So like, as you start this company, you've got this deer mineral, you're putting it out, and now you feel like you've got to relate to your customers. Like, what was your first year hunting like, or like the experiences?
The very next year after the 8-point, he was killed in 01. So in 02, I went gun hunting. A nice, really nice young 8-point came under me. I could have thrown my gun at him, and I let him go because I knew he had potential. And even then I knew enough that age is so critical, and he looked young, and I didn't even consider dropping him. I could have easily, especially with a shotgun. And then I started bow hunting. Actually, the year the 8-point was killed, the neighbor said that he didn't get the big one, and that shocked me. But after I heard it from two different people and they described it the same way, I knew I needed something other than just one to prove my scenario. I didn't have to kill it myself, but I really wanted to go out there and see it and have a chance at it. 2 years later, I saw the one that they described, and he would have beat Hansen as a typical, no question. Just absolutely crazy big, typical 13-point. And I can easily talk about him because he's long gone. This is 20 years ago. So I wasn't talking about him as freely back then, but I ended up seeing him 4 times bow hunting. And that kind of cemented my interest in being out in the woods, even though I knew there was very little chance that I would ever harvest a deer of that caliber. But just seeing him was the experience of a lifetime. And that was right here in Hillsdale County. And he was the one everybody dreams of.
And so what's the story on that 8-point? Because it sounds like there must be the area must have good genetics in big deer. And if you're from Michigan, Hillsdale County, Jackson County, those kind of southern counties where they say the big ones, are killed and hang out.
Let me stop you right there. So most of that activity, especially in Hillsdale County, I'm not as familiar with Jackson County, has happened since Lucky Buck came on the market. So when Aaron Davis killed the state record for archery in 03, he was 35 inches bigger than anything ever killed in Hillsdale County before that. So we have the same genetics, we have the same soybeans, we have the same alfalfa. But yet, as Lucky Buck came out, we started in Hillsdale County and being marketed in Hillsdale County. I'm not saying it's all cause and effect, but it's interesting from my perspective to see that all of a sudden we kill a 225-inch buck when the biggest one ever killed prior to that in Hillsdale County was 191 inches. And since then, I know personally people using Lucky Buck killing, there's multiple 200+ inch bucks out of Hillsdale County since then. But a lot of the bigger deer coming from the southern tier of counties is also just, we have a lot better land here. We have, I relate the crop yields very similar, parallel the antler size. You look at Iowa, Illinois have tremendous yields on corn and soybeans. some of that has to do with age structure as well, at compounding the benefit. But you look at the crop yields in southern Michigan versus northern Michigan, there's about as much difference as there is between Illinois and Iowa and southern Michigan. And a lot of that just natural fertility and that the deer have that advantage right there.
Yeah. But it would seem that, you're to have a 185-inch 8-point would have to have good genetics before the mass, yes. Right?
So genetics plays a factor, no doubt about it. He would have been phenomenal without Lucky Buck. But in my biased opinion, I don't think he would have been anywhere near what he is now. And there was another one. Actually, we figure it was his twin was killed the year before. They were running together, and the guy had his choice of the two, and he took the other one. And there's where your age comes in. This 8-point was hit twice previous years with arrows in his shoulder when they tanned his hide. I mean, you need to get to that 4-year-old. And in Michigan, where we kill 2 bucks a year, you just don't get very many to that 4-year-old. I have told people when discussing this that southern Michigan could easily be competitive with any other state in the country if we would just kill 1 buck a year and we would get some age structure onto our bucks. But with as many hunters and as much hunting pressure as we have, I think we have, a real uphill battle getting an age structure on our deer. So age was number one, even over genetics. But obviously, he was elite on the genetic side of it. But when discussing genetics, you can't control that unless you have a high fence. You can't really harvest for genetic. You can't, cull. You never know what that buck's going to turn into. If he's small as a young deer, it's likely because his mother didn't take care of him as good. Maybe he was a twin. Maybe he was born late. Maybe he was injured. Maybe he was sick. But if you give him a chance, he'll likely catch up to his contemporaries in a couple of years. And there's very little you can do to control genetics. And, there's really no reason. I do not believe that Illinois or Iowa or Buffalo County, Wisconsin have a genetic advantage to us. There's variation in genetics within any group, any geographical area, but they don't have better genetics than we do. They have a better age structure. They have better nutrition. They have all of that, but there's no reason why the best genetic deer stay there and don't, spread pretty much evenly throughout the country. Now there's a difference north to south in body size and the heat plays an impact, but from a genetic standpoint, it's going to even itself out. It's going to, that variation is going to be within a species, within an area. And yes, that 8-point was phenomenal on genetics as well. It takes to get a world-class deer, it takes everything clicking at the same time. When I set up my display, I put up thousands of inches of replica antlers of deer that were harvested on Lucky Buck. And I tell people, these are all mistakes. Somebody would have harvested every one of these deer the year before if they would have had a chance. What I want to do is I want to produce, especially in Michigan, I want to produce a 2.5-year-old buck that's worth hanging on your wall. If I can accomplish that, if I can make him look like he's a 3.5-year-old when he's a 2.5, before everybody else has a chance to shoot him, and before he gets smart enough and educated by all those people that wound him or shoot at him or miss him, if I can make that deer look like he's a 3.5-year-old when he's a 2.5-year-old, most of my customers are going to be happy most of the time. Then if one of those gets by and you get that 3.5 or 4.5-year-old, then and you combine that with the genetics, the best, if he happens to be one of the best genetic ones in your area, then you've got the world-class deer. But those are rare, and those are what people love to talk about. But I love to talk practicality and that putting an extra year's worth of size on that 2.5 or on that younger buck in your area where you've not seen him before is what really most of us are all about.
So back on the 8 point, and kind of what I was trying to figure out is you said you've been on Lucky Buck, you've been feeding Lucky Buck for a while.
3 years.
Yeah. So it kind of sounds like, and I don't know how much pressure was there on your farm there, because it almost sounds like there was this old farmer that's feeding, he's got mineral sites set up, but nobody hunts there, and this is where all the big deer go to grow old, and then now you go in there and you get to hunt them.
It was not a sanctuary by any means. There was so the one guy that actually found his sheds had 2 sons hunting that buck. They saw him the morning he was killed on their property. They pushed him over onto my property where Vic shot him. The other guy feeding the mineral was a 1/4 mile away to the south of my farm. His 2 sons also saw him during bow season, videotaped him during bow season on their 10 acres of property. So they both had legitimate chances at this buck, but neither of them could close the deal. And the second time they actually pushed him, they tried to sneak up on him. They saw him in a fence row, tried to sneak up on him, pushed him across, and Vic ended up shooting him on my property. But this area it's within a 1/2 mile of state hunting, the Lost Nations hunting preserve. And the fact that he was wounded twice, the fact that his twin brother was killed the year before, is a good indication of the degree of luck involved that he ended up getting to be 4 years old instead of 3. So.
Sure. Now with the Lucky Buck, and I know it's impossible to quantify, but your marketing and everything says, you'll see difference within a year if you will give your money back after 2 years. The guy that put us in touch, Tracy, was talking about what you guys would call a typical Lucky Buck deer. Like you can tell that he's been eating, or so what are you seeing in terms of antler growth from using your product?
For some reason, and I can't explain this at all, I have no reason that it would be, but mass is the one thing that just really sticks out when you look down the lineup that we take to the shows and stuff, and they just put on mass. And we have had wild deer that people know it's the same deer. Otherwise, one of them had a double throat patch, and that's unusual, and it was coming into the same place. And 1 year to the next, it more than doubled his mass when they started feeding Lucky Buck. And over all these years, there's enough of those types of stories where they know it's the same deer, but it's hard to believe, and it's vastly increased the mass. And one other story that I like to share, and I wish I could show this because it's just so dramatic, but the guy that made the first replica of that 8 point was up in White Cloud. And when I took him that rack, he was a complete skeptic. He said, phenomenal genetics or something. I told him I was going to promote my mineral using this replica. And he was a skeptic, but he had a couple of deer that he used bottle fed babies. When they grew up, he checked the eyes and the ears for his taxidermy work. And so he knew what those deer were. He only had 2 bucks. It wasn't like this was the best example out of 100 deer, but he started feeding a Lucky Buck just for kicks because he was skeptical. And he was feeding I think a Purina deer chow pellet. It should have been properly formulated. And if I would have had to bet at that point, I would have said, this isn't going to make any difference because they already got selenium. They already got the stuff that I'm doing, and you're force feeding it, and it's not going to make a difference. the difference, I have the sheds from that buck the 2 previous years at 3 and 4, and that was as a 5-year-old that he started feeding the mineral, and he could not believe it. It doubled the mass and looked exactly like Vic's 8-point as far as mass. And before, he was just a fairly normal looking deer. And we've done that on a couple of other high fence bucks where it's not the same, but gives an indication that it's somehow affecting the mass more than anything else. But
maybe you know the answer to this, maybe not, but it would seem relevant here. Like, I've heard different people talk about deer and when their antler growth like peaks around that 4 or 5 years, and then it seems almost like a ground shrinkage thing when guys say like, oh, I thought he was bigger or whatever. But you also get a lot of guys saying, like, oh yeah, that deer was probably on the way down, or they've got pictures of him and he was bigger last year. Have you heard anything or have any photo evidence or whatever to say that this is continuing the upswing or lengthening that?
Please, if anybody wants to get serious about managing their deer, send the teeth in. Know how old that deer is, because I know we have people killing deer that are younger than what they think they are once they get on a program like this. And there's 2 examples. It's going to take a little more time than maybe you want, but they really hit home to me as to what we're doing from an age structure standpoint. I had one guy that was in Wisconsin. I didn't get his name. He just called me up and he just kind of spilled his heart to me that they switched to Lucky Buck, and they had a large co-op and they aged every deer that they killed. But first, everybody guessed how old they thought they would be based on rack size. Before feeding Lucky Buck, they knew about what to expect. And everybody was wrong on almost every deer by 1 or 2 years, the years they were feeding Lucky Buck. They were younger than what they thought they were based on the antler size. Some reason they switched to another brand. They didn't quit feeding mineral completely. They switched to another brand. I don't know whether it was cost, or I don't know whether it was somebody good salesmanship or whatever. And they went right back to where they were. They were not getting that 1 to 2 year advantage on antler size. The other example I want to give you is the only clean 8-point ever killed bigger than Vic Bowhunter's one that was on Lucky Buck was killed in Cannon Falls, Minnesota. And it's bigger than this 8-point. And it's a clean 8-point with 30-inch beams, scores in the low 190s. But that buck was 8 years old. He was killed illegally, so that's why I still consider this one the world's biggest 8-point. The DNR has the rack. It's so similar to this one mass-wise, but it's 5 inches wider. It has a 30-inch spread, 30-inch beams, and he was 8 years old. And the guy that was hunting him had been feeding Lucky Buck for 4 years. Has the sheds on him as a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old, and he's bigger at 8 than he was at both 6 and 7. And I truly believe that the Lucky Buck is going to prolong you're going to have larger antlers later in life on these deer. Normally they are going to peak at somewhere 5.5 or 6.5. And there was another one in Kansas that was an 8-year-old buck, and he was bigger at 8 than he was at 7 and 6. I do have one more story on a high fence buck that the guy bought as a 10-year-old just to see what he would do. And he more than doubled his mass he bought him as a 9-year-old. His 10-year-old on Lucky Buck was the most antler he'd ever had in his entire life. And he ended up living to be 13 years old and got bigger every year through 13 years. But it's one example. It's a high fence buck. It's not really relevant to much conversation other than it was phenomenal to see what that deer did compared to what he was even in his prime. So.
And so what you were talking about of that 1 or 2 year advantage, and for a Michigan 2-year-old, you're kind of hamstrung now with the rules that were supposed to, that they've put in place. Where are you at, or is there like any sort of like collaboration with other mineral or feed companies or whatever to lobby for able to use in this state and maybe other states where it's not allowed?
In Michigan, there was a really big push 3 years ago, maybe, and it actually passed. I testified at both the House and Senate subcommittee meetings, and it actually passed, and the governor vetoed it. But to repeal the baiting ban, and my argument on that, if you go to, I have a YouTube video up there that's pretty popular, or that's been out for quite a bit. I actually testified the same session that Ted Nugent testified, but he got all the press, but I spoke there, and that recording has actually got I think a pretty good explanation of why I think it's so important to repeal the ban. And I actually think that the DNR and the biologists are wrong in their strategy for banning supplementation, especially minerals, because it helps the health of the deer. And I think that they're looking at it from a totally wrong view, because the deer are going to travel for food, for breeding, for protection, shelter, but they're also going to travel for sodium. They're going to look for sodium. And they're also, as far as food sources, they're going to look for food sources, and the fewer the sources, the further they're going to travel. And I think a huge component of the potential spreading of CWD is the travel. I mean, if there's a positive case of CWD in Jackson County, I don't want my Hillsdale County bucks traveling and making contact with those Jackson County ones. And so I laid out the numbers of sodium sources, potential natural occurring sodium sources versus the number of deer. And that's what I gave in my testimony there. And one of the senators that was on the committee actually inadvertently made a very good point. He said that in Newaygo County, we have 20 to 30,000 hunters. And if they all put out bait piles, that's going to be a tremendous amount of congregating of the deer. Well, if Newaygo County has anywhere near the average number of deer for the state, they have between 20 and 30,000 deer in the state. And if you have 20 or 30,000 bait piles, each one has their own private pile, they won't need to travel at all. That would be the perfect scenario. It's when there's a combine spill or an apple tree, or a limited number of places that the deer can go for those food sources, that you run into the problem, because then the deer from a contaminated area or potentially problematic area will travel and come in contact with the group that isn't, and they'll take it back to their group. So it's more the travel that's my concern. And if I can provide them with a salt source, I sold 50,000 buckets, a lucky buck, in the state of Michigan the year prior to me testifying for this. And if Trophy Rocks sold a similar number, and all of our competitors combined sold that many more, it's 150,000 more sources that those deer can not have to travel to. And so the DNR and they referred me to their state vet, and he dismissed me out of hand, didn't even have a discussion with me. But it's it's their prerogative, but I think they're approaching it wrong. And I think that the evidence that they point to in other states like Wisconsin and Illinois is where the DNR says, the contrast between Illinois' strict ban and Wisconsin's not being strict about it has created a much higher incidence in Wisconsin than Illinois. Well, it's totally bogus, because chronic wasting was in Wisconsin for probably 20 years. And then Illinois pretty obviously moved from Wisconsin into Illinois much more recently. And that's the reason for the number of cases, rather than, the management and the baiting bans and feeding bans that have been in place. So there's a lot to that argument, and there's a lot to think about. Chronic wasting is a serious disease. There's no question about it. It's everything they say about it as far as how bad it is, I agree with. It's just a matter of how to manage for it. And coming from me, it sounds like, I want to actually, it's an economic thing, but in reality, I actually think we're selling more mineral in the states that have the bans than we ever have before, because it's easier to hide for one reason than the corn or the apples or the carrots, and it's not as, and I see large quantities of food sources being very problematic. I see dumping truckloads of corn and carrots and stuff, and that being very much a problem. But a conscientious use of small amounts in what we need is more sites rather than less and smaller amounts. That's the key to it. But that's we haven't been given that opportunity. We had an opportunity with those subcommittee meetings and actually being passed through both the House and Senate, but with the veto, that pretty much I don't see it really coming back to make any difference, or being tried again because of that veto power.
So I guess, but that passed, and then it was the governor. So would it, with another governor, would that be
I think
bring it up again?
I think if the House and Senate remain similarly politically aligned, and we get a different governor, then it's a definite possibility then. But from my perspective, other than, as long as the enforcement isn't drastically increased, I look at it, and I shouldn't probably, but I look at it very similar to driving the speed limit. And I've used this a lot at the Iowa Deer Classic when people from Illinois come over and to my booth, and they say, well, we can't use it. And I said, did you drive the speed limit when you drove to this show? And they usually chuckle. And I tell them that I drive as fast as I can, as long as I'm safe and people around me are safe, and I don't get caught. So, and I look at this very similarly to that if I know that I'm not endangering, or I feel confident that I'm not endangering myself or somebody else, I keep quiet about it, or I just don't. My biggest frustration, frankly, especially from Michigan, is that, and other states for longer periods of time for that matter, is I can't utilize the stories that people are giving me because I would incriminate the person if I used them. There's been some tremendous bucks in Illinois killed using Lucky Buck, and I can't use them. And for the last however many years it is in Michigan, there's been some really nice bucks, and I can't use them. So, that's one of my frustrations. But from a sales standpoint, I'm probably better off with a ban in effect than from an economic standpoint. So.
And so for you as a company and the rules that are in place, like how does the government not say that you can't sell it? I mean, and that's one of the things with the synthetic or whatever deer you're in has to be ATA approved. That stuff's all over the shelves everywhere. And that's one of the big things I know the listeners in New Jersey are talking about. They say you can't do this, and then it's everywhere and you can buy it. Like, where do you think that's going?
So the only state that I've ever had an issue with as far as the state trying to stop the sale is New York State. And they've been illegal since 2002, I believe. They went in, they put the ban in effect the same time that Illinois did, and Wisconsin, all of them. There was a big push in 2002, right when I was getting started. But New York State there was a lot of dealers in New York State that refused to put it on the shelves for some reason. That state in particular tried to put an emphasis on the actual sale of it. In all of the rest of the states, from my experience, it's just the end user. How they use it is they're responsible. So the selling of it, you could, especially in Michigan, you could be going to the UP or you could be going out of state, like on our border counties here. You could easily be buying it in Michigan and taking it out of state where it's legal to use. It's legal in Ohio anytime. It's legal in Indiana as long as you're not hunting over it. You can feed it in the spring. So that's kind of the reason the retailers don't have a problem with handling. Some of them do. And I have one dealer in particular in Michigan that just won't sell anything that's not legal to use in the state. But only one that I know of has quit handling the Lucky Buck, and it's user's discretion rather than this actual point of sale that's the problem. So.
And so, just to kind of wrapping up, close out here, like you've also got some like the freak factor on there. So what is that?
So that's a brand new product, and I've understanding the limitations of Lucky Buck as an attractant in late season, and hunger wins. But the problem is most people are actually hurting the health of the deer in order to bring them in and to attract them. And I'm referring mostly to just shelled corn. Shelled corn is, the deer love it. There's no question about it. They come in, especially with a little snow cover and late season when the crops are off the fields. You put corn out, you'll have deer, no question about it. It's cheap generally, although this year's the exception. It's a little bit weather resistant with a hard shell on it, with a whole corn versus like a ground product or a pelleted product that gets mushy and spoils pretty quickly. So shelled corn it's available anywhere, pretty well nationwide, and it gets sold by the truckloads, literal truckloads. The problem is that it's low in protein, it's low in calcium, it's high in carbs, and the deer like it so much that they overeat on it and they get sick. And there's a lot of deer that have died from slug feeding corn. We'd never, back to my ag background, back to my nutrition background, we would never feed cattle or horses or any domestic animals for that matter a bunch of corn all of a sudden when they weren't acclimated to it. It would make them sick. They would get acidosis, they would get diarrhea, they would potentially kill them if we fed them too much corn when they weren't accustomed to it. Well, our deer, even though they have access to a cornfield, say, and they have to work to get it off the cob, and they have to work to get walk the fields to find it. We dump whole shelled corn in a pile for them, and they will get sick. Now, I have no problem with timed feeders. I have no problem with keeping a consistent source of corn out there. But the weekend warrior that dumps 100 pounds of corn out there, that deer comes in, gets deathly sick. The weekend warrior comes back the next weekend, sees that it's gone, assumes the deer like it, dumps another 100 pounds out. Well, that deer went through a series of diarrhea, stomach upset, is just finally recovering by the next weekend, comes out and does it again. And about the third time, that deer is going to be deathly, is going to have lost weight, is going to be in really bad shape. So I came up with Freak Factor as an alternative. I have a patent applied for intentionally to slow the rate of usage. I think the critical thing is small, frequent meals when you're working with a hunger-based attractant. I want a higher protein than what corn does, and I want a lower consumption rate. And what we've done, and we're using the same thing that we've used with our Lucky Buck for 25 years. We're using salt to control intake, and we're slowing the rate of consumption down. You can feed this straight, or you can mix it with your corn, and you can slow the rate at which they'll eat that corn by the ratio which you make with this. So you can do 50-50, 80-20, 20-80. You can make that corn last longer. We've also got preservatives in it so it won't spoil nearly as quickly as what most grain products will spoil. But you mix this with your corn or standalone, and you're going to have a really good attractant. And we're looking at pre and post rut and through the wintertime feeding for this primarily. And it's when usually I want you to maintain your Lucky Buck site, but they're usually not really active on it at that time of year anyway. This will give you an extra boost for your attractant, and it'll give them a boost in fat and protein when they really need it in late winter or through the winter and late after rut, when they're trying to regain their weight loss after, especially in Michigan, running their butts off almost literally. Anytime an animal loses a third of its body weight in a matter of weeks, it's not going to recover. And that's a key part of putting that antler on the next year is that body recovering during the rut season. So.
Awesome. Yeah, we got some of that sent down to Ohio. First, my father-in-law has a lease he's been working with down there, and so we'll see what what yields for us for the upcoming season. So I really appreciate you taking the time with us, and it's been very interesting for the science behind it is always interesting, and from a non-hunter perspective, and almost like a very wholesome approach to it from the beginning, saying like, I know I can make them healthier, and then oh my gosh, their antlers just seem to grow also. So like I say, I really appreciate you taking the time. Where can people find Lucky Buck? If they don't have it in their area, how do they order it? Where can if they have got questions, how do they go about getting those answered?
Just Google, just search for our website, luckybuckmineral.com, and if you have any questions, you can get our phone number and you can call us directly there too. But there's so many stores that are carrying it now, and if your local one doesn't, I encourage you to go in and have them ordered in for you. If you request it, usually they'll go ahead and stock it. The shipping is quite prohibitive on it, so we don't encourage direct sales. We like to go through our dealer network, which is pretty extensive. We've got thousands of stores that have it, but if yours doesn't, if you can go in and talk to the manager or owner and have them contact us, we'll get them we'll set them up as a dealer, and that's the best way to get it by far for us. So.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.